My name is Tudor Vilcan from the Open University in the UK, and I am one of the research assistants that worked for the last 3 years on the project called Urban Flood Resilience. I'm just trying to verify if everything's okay. Everything seems to be working fine.
I can see and hear you, Tudor, so you're good to go.
Great, I'm gonna hide the panel now. Great, so thank you very much. Today I'm gonna be talking about the opportunities and challenges of implementing a Learning and Action Alliance. Paul has used the word collaboration a lot. So a Learning and Action Alliance is a form of collaboration. So the way in which I'm going to structure this presentation is going to be, first, I will talk about what a Learning and Action Alliance is and how it is a very specific form of collaboration. And then second, I'm gonna detail the work we have done over the last 3 years as part of the Ebbsfleet LAA, which we have called the Ebbsfleet Water Forum. So every time I will be talking about the Ebbsfleet Water Forum, just bear in mind it's the very specific name that we have given to the Ebbsfleet Learning and Action Alliance. And then third, after I've presented all of that, I will try to give a bit of insight into the lessons that I've learned, most of them from my perspective as one of the organizers of the Learning and Action Alliances. Usually, an LA is usually it's a collaboration, but we would like to call it an open arrangement where participants comes together to create a joint understanding of the problem, in this case having to do with water management and flood risk management, and to come up with possible solutions, all of this based on rational criticism, based on discussion, based on dialogue, and based on consensus building. Now, one of the sort of more unique pitches of an LA as a specific form of collaboration has to do with the idea that is focused a lot more on the identification of innovative ideas for solving wicked problems. Now, you might ask yourself, what are wicked problems? Generally, we call wicked problems those problems that have multiple and conflicting criteria for defining solutions, where the solutions often create problems for other stakeholders involved, and where there are no rules for determining when problems can be said to be solved. And one way in which we do this is outside the constraints of existing formal institutional settings. So nobody in this LA comes to the LA as an expert in something, but a lot of the time it's all about bringing your knowledge for the purposes of learning and sharing, rather than saying, hey, I'm the expert, I know what the solution is. Because as I said, the problems being tackled in an LA are problems that are wicked problems. Now, the solutions are then, and the ideas are then presented in formal inter-organizational decision-making process. So then the outputs of the LA are then inscribed into the real world, into decision-making, into trying to make and trying to aid real-world decision-making processes. One principle of a Learning and Action Alliance that is very important is that it doesn't have a fixed structure, but the structure is decided by the participants themselves. And following up on that idea is that idea that it has its own specific vision that evolves over time. So it's not particularly prescriptive. There's not a clear-cut formula as to how to organize and how to conduct an LAA. But this is something that is actually very is driven by context and by the participants themselves, and then usually requires a champions to drive and sustain it at least until it gets going for a little bit. The literature, in the academic literature on Learning and Action Alliance, this is one of the figures that you will see quite often, is it's how to establish and run an LA. So obviously, there's a stage of initiation, which can be done by any stakeholder or group of stakeholders that are interested in a specific issue or specific problem, and then there is scoping, understanding the context, and understanding how this can be done, And then obviously once this is set up, at least primarily, then it's all about developing a shared vision. And the biggest part will be about stage number 4 is about implementation. And then once it's implemented, it's all about capturing the outcomes, the outputs, and trying to see if we can identify any quick wins, which are outputs that can be implemented in some specific windows of opportunity when these windows of opportunity arise. And then it's back to scoping and context. It's redeveloping the shared vision. So it's a very iterative process, and that's very important to keep in mind. In terms of the Ebbsfleet Water Forum, we are at stage 4 and stage 5. So we've implemented we've implemented a system dynamic, or we developed a system dynamic model based on the shared vision we had at the beginning, and now we're trying to capture the outputs, and then we're trying to reiterate a new phase of the Ebbsfleet Water Forum, but I'll talk about that in a bit more in a few moments. So from the academic literature, again, what are some of the benefits of joining an LAA? Well, a lot of it is about networking, so then opening and broadening communication channels, establishing new channels, and then strengthening a new existing relationship, but also developing new relationship with the new stakeholders that join the Learning and Action Alliance. The big part about LAAs is the co-production of knowledge, and then learning from discussion, learning from one another. And here it's very important that most of the LAAs just leave a lot of the organizational and professional remit outside and try to come with an open mind. There's obviously opportunities for collaborative working, for common goals, identification of joint funding schemes, and realization of common goals. And a big part of an LAA, it's about communal outcomes. As a sort of as other perks, you have speeding up data sharing between partners. If there's academic involvement, then there's access and influence to academic research. So these are just a few of the things that are picked up in the literature. I will talk in a lot more details about what we've done in the Ebbsfleet LAA. So we're coming to the Ebbsfleet LAA and talking about it in more specific terms, what we've called the Ebbsfleet Water Forum. Well, another big aspect of an LAA is about its membership. So it kind of, as a template, it operates this formula with an organizing group, a core group, and a wider group. So obviously the organizing group is the one that coordinates the LAA, the core group is the one that attends the regular meetings, and the wider group is the one that participates more infrequently. So in terms of the Ebbsfleet Water Forum, as part of the organizing group, we had the Urban Flood Resilience Consortium. So that was myself and other colleagues of mine. And then there was the Ebbsfleet Development Corporation. And then as a core group, we had a number of the most important stakeholders in Ebbsfleet: Southern Water, Thames Water, Kent County Council, Dartford Borough Council, Gresham Borough Council, Swanscombe Town Council, Kent Wildlife Trust. And then in terms of the wider group, we had the River Trust, Environment Agency, companies like Ebballeet, other members of the Kent County Council. And here, this is a mistake. It says Henley Camlin, which is the developer. We did try to get Henley Camlin, and we did try to get a number of other stakeholders, other developers. Unfortunately, we were not very successful. And this is part of the challenges of an LAA, and I'll talk about that towards the end a bit more. Now, one of the things that I've pointed or I have alluded to earlier on was the fact that LAAs generally do not have, they have a big template to work with, but they don't really have a specific formula. There's different ways to configure and shape an LA, and a lot of it is down to the context. Where are you doing the LA? Because it needs to be very focused. So when we were, the Urban Flood Resilience Consortium is in many ways a follow-up to another consortium called the Blue-Green Cities. And as part of Blue-Green Cities, the Newcastle Learning and Action Alliance was established. And I want to talk about it really quickly to kind of get you a sense of the configuration of that Learning and Action Alliance and how it's different from the Ebbsfleet Water Forum. So what's similar is that in the Newcastle LA, there were 3 to 4 workshops a year, usually kind of half a day. But every single workshop, or most of the workshops, were organized by a different stakeholder in Newcastle. And the LAA was focused on blue-green infrastructure as a way of dealing with flood risk and for future proofing, especially climate change proofing. And a lot of the time, stakeholders were coming to hear about other people's work with blue-green infrastructure and find out about innovative approaches. And then one of the watershed moments is in 2006, the Newcastle Declaration on Blue and Green Infrastructure, which commits the city of Newcastle to the blue and green infrastructure principles, and this was reiterated in 2019. So, and the new, as Paul said, this LA is still running, and there's going to be a more specific session on it in December. One of the things to bear in mind, though, is that in the Newcastle LA benefited from in many ways from the 2012 Newcastle flooding, because that perked up the interest in flood risk management quite a lot. And that's, I would say, maybe it's a slightly unusual scenario, because a lot of places in England don't have, or some places in England don't have such a recent history of flooding. Now, that was also the case with Ebbsfleet Water Forum. There wasn't necessarily, water was an important item of the agenda, but it wasn't the kind of the most important, or one of the most important items of the agenda. And that needed to be factored in when we talk about the context for the establishment of the Ebbsfleet Water Forum. As Simon will talk about in a few minutes, the Ebbsfleet Garden City is not yet built, or for the most part is not yet built, is yet to be built. It's going to be one of the garden cities commissioned by the government. So the development of the Garden City was the most important topic. So the vision for it was, the vision for the Ebbsfleet Water Forum was, how can we assist with sustainable and waterproofing solutions for Ebbsfleet? And then in our second meeting, we started to circulate these ideas about doing and coming up with the model, and we came up with a few models, and then we've chosen a system dynamics model. But the focus was on contributing to the sustainable water management in Ebbsfleet. And you can see the picture you see on the screen is one of the first sessions where we were trying to sort of understand what the major problem is and how to solve it. So I'm going to talk a bit more about the system dynamics model. I'm going to start at the top with the completed model and its findings, and then I'm going to go into the process by which we've arrived at this model and its conclusions, because I think that that's the most important part, because that's the core of an LA experience, the process. So a system dynamic model, it tries to model the structure of a system. So in this case is the potable water use in Ebbsfleet, and to investigate its behavior over time. And this is one of the reasons why we've chosen it, because Ebbsfleet has not been built yet. So we wanted to see how different water solutions would affect it over time. And then in this case, our system dynamic model contains both qualitative and quantitative variables. And what you see on the screen at the moment is a causal loop diagram, which is a map of the causal relations between variables. And that is later on followed by a stock and flow diagram, which is where somebody, an expert in system dynamics model, will just go about and crunch all the numbers into the system to come up with equations to come up with the results. But this is quite important as well, the causal loop diagram, because it's, in a way, it's a visual representation of the relations between the variables. Now, I'll draw your attention to the central problem, which is potable water use, which was not the initial problem, but it became the problem through a process of iteration. And then some of the most important variables I will draw your attention to the right. If you look at rainwater harvesting, that a bit higher up to greywater use, and then if we go to the left, you will see things like variables like meter properties, use of water efficiency devices, saving water behavior. So this was also some of the things that were tested as part of the system dynamics model. Now, the next thing I want to talk about are the findings, but I don't want to spend too much time on it because this is very Ebbsfleet specific, and the audience, I'm assuming, is national, international, so not everybody's going to find this necessarily interesting. But if you need more information, you can always email me and I can send you a copy of the report. I think it will be also available on our website as well. If you like the bird's eye view of the system, there was also another model called the metabolism model that was developed by Dr. Ahilan Sangralingam from University of Exeter to kind of complement this, and that's a more granular, more focused, quantitative model. But really quickly, I'm gonna try to read some of the findings of the model. So one of them was that a command and control approach provides only limited improvement in the water balance over the long term. That's it, of the water balance of the city of Ebbsfleet, while the activation of socio-environmental and economic policy incentives shows the more relevant increase, particularly due to the support of practices such as greywater reuse and rainwater harvesting. Second, the need for collective effort, the role of synergistic measures and actions are essential for improving system conditions. So things need to work in tandem rather than isolation. Specifically in terms of rainwater harvesting, it benefits more from the introduction of economic incentives, while regulatory policy instruments are almost ineffective on the outdoor residential use of potable water. And finally, the model shows that that increasing the water tariff by 20% can improve the water balance due to less use of potable water. Now, these are very interesting in and of themselves, and they're, as Simon will talk about in a second, they are incorporated in the Ebbsfleet water strategy. But I want to talk a bit more about the process, because this is the important part of an LAA. So in the initial stages, what we've done, we've tried to, in the black rectangle, we tried to define what the problem is. Then we came up with problem dimensions, which you see in the quality of place, water quality, water use. And then we started to define, in the hexagons, we tried to define the metrics for each one of them. And from this stage on, it was all about learning. One of the advantages of conducting workshop for a system dynamics model is that it forces questions that need communal answers and need consensus building. And this is an example of it. In the workshops, there was a lot of learning. There was a lot of discussion. There's a lot of criticism, like rational criticism, constructive criticism, because we've put this this exercise to the stakeholders, to try to, for example, think about biodiversity, think about what its causes are, direct causes, indirect causes, what are the drivers of change, what are the direct effects, direct, indirect effects, and here this meant that all stakeholders needed to come together and to discuss these issues. And there wasn't this thing where somebody says, you know what, I will give you an answer to this problem, because this wasn't a problem that lended itself to one particular answer. It's more about consensus building. As a fun fact, biodiversity was eventually dropped because we could not reach a consensus on it. But that was also the case with other of the problem dimensions, because essentially in the beginning the system dynamics model was entirely too ambitious, and then we started, through various iterations, we started to focus a lot more on water use. So here on the left you see some of the earlier stages where we were trying to make sense of these variables, and we're trying to make sense of the relations between variables. And then on the right, the picture on the right is our first attempt to put together a causal loop diagram. And this has been iterated at least 8 or 9 times ever since, and 2 of the times with the entire LAA. So this is a very reiterative process where you just go over and over again, and try to focus the clarity of the variables and the relations between them. Right, I still have another 5 minutes, I think. So I'm going to try to talk about the opportunities, and then I'm going to talk about the challenges of organizing this kind of LA. And I want to stress at the top that this was a very specific kind of learning and action alliance, where for this specific stage of 3 years, we've tried to develop, for most part at least, a system dynamics model. So one of the big opportunities is that it allowed us to create a communal product that would be very hard to create otherwise. So as I try to point out again and again in this presentation, the system dynamic model, it wasn't about the correct answer, but it was about building a consensus between all the professionals working, but professionals that didn't work from the viewpoint of I represent this water company, or I represent this council, or I represent this institution, but it was more I lend my expertise to create this, and I'm learning in the process. And the second thing that I would point out, I think that this is the most important part of an LAA, is the social learning. Because if you were present in those meetings, you would have definitely seen that people were genuinely engaging with one another and learning from one another. With the exception of one instance, which is an anecdote, where somebody from outside who's hasn't been part of the project of the LA came and said, well, some of these things can be done with some equations on the side of on the back of an envelope. But I think that A, I don't think that's possible, and B, it misses on this extraordinary process of learning from one another, of engaging with one another. That is, I think, is key, and I think it's very difficult to replicate in other contexts, specifically where the institution takes prevalence in a collaboration. This, again, bear in mind, was a lot more based on innovation than anything else. And third is this idea of capacity building, that stakeholders can now take decisions in greater knowledge of what everybody else around them is doing. And I think that this idea of capacity building, everybody builds their capacity differently as part of the Learning and Action Alliance, because a lot of it is informal, but essentially a lot of the stakeholders, and I know from my experience and the experience of all the others participating in this, is that we learn and build our capacity to do an act simply by being part of it and by participating in it. And I think that another important part is trust building, which is something that kind of flies under the radar in the literature, in my opinion. And trust comes from being in the meetings and comes from being face to face and discussing in the meeting, comes from communal deliberations, and comes from that consensus building. And it definitely breaks down many of or a lot of the barriers between stakeholders. And obviously, the fifth is the dissemination of information. The dissemination and information. So in the meeting, in the workshop, we had plenty of moments where our stakeholders talked about what each other were, what everybody was doing. Either that was done either informally, where somebody was making a point and they were saying, oh, by the way, we're doing this, or there's somebody else doing this, or formally, we also had presentations as part of the workshops. So that's a way to catch up and learn about what happened in the area. Now, in terms of the challenges, I split them in crucial challenges and substantial challenges, but really all of them, I would say, most of them, I would say, come under this umbrella of austerity. I think that's one of the biggest problem. So essentially, there were a lot of time constraints and resources shortage on the part of the stakeholders. And for me, the most stressful part of organizing this LA was on the day when I would receive 3 or 4 emails saying, I know I'm supposed to come, but there's something more important that happens. There's an emergency. I need to attend to this and that. And that was one of the problems. Also, I think that especially this kind of LAA, which is different from the Newcastle LA, where different stakeholders took ownership of different kind of sessions. If you're trying to build something communal as part of the LAA, I think it's unlikely to succeed without the champion organizer sort of type, somebody to actually really drive it. And a lot of the work was done by the consortium, also behind the scenes. Now, in terms of some of the substantial challenges, this collaborative inertia, where there's slow progress, or there's a bit of a halt to the progress, and stakeholders don't really see exactly where we're heading, and that was also an issue. There was this turnover of stakeholders. Some of them will sort of miss 1 or 2 or 3 meetings, and there'll be others, and there will be a bit of turnover, which again happens because a lot of them drop on the day or stuff like this. There's also more generally this issue of timetabling, of getting 13 stakeholders together and agreeing on a date and a time, and that's also very difficult to do. And as I said, it's quite time consuming for the organizers, which might not be the case with the Learning and Action Alliance, where the stakeholders take ownership on it. So what I've tried to do here is to just give you a very earnest, honest take on some of the opportunities and challenges of doing this very specific kind of collaboration and Learning and Action Alliance. And I hope that was informative and helpful for you. Thank you.